Let's go.
Once upon a time, we share the stories of old. Bring the book to life in a way never told. Let's go for a ride, never let go. Fresh fairy tales, the top of the show. Fresh fairy tales.
Let's go.
Give me a turn at the back.
The wagon is for firewood, not for you, Gretala. Hanseli, push.
I'm tired.
I'm hungry.
If you're hungry, then go to the garden and get some vegetables.
I want a lollies.
How come you don't grow lollies?
If you want to eat, you need to work.
I like eating. I don't like working.
You two are so lazy.
We are so lazy, and Dad's always got chores for me.
Hate working, but want money. I need to sleep for my beauty.
Just want my LOL.
Hey!
That means lots of lollies.
Don't like veggies, throw them all away. Allergies and
Eat the cucumber instead of the cheese.
Don't listen, never ask for permission. Naughtiness on repetition. We lazy people get along. So lazy, we don't even finish this.
Hanseli, Gretala, veolua.
Dad! Dad! Hanseli, wake up!
Where's our house? Where's my breakfast?
I don't know.
OMG! Dad left us in a forest? Oh, you know when I see Dad, I'm gonna grow him so much.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I'm gonna give him the evils like this.
Well, I'm gonna turn my back on him like this.
And I'm gonna slam the door on him like this.
Then I'm gonna stomp my feet like this.
Yeah, that was good. That was good.
Wait, so where's our house?
Look, there's a trail of cabin bread that leads this way. I guess Dad wants us to follow it home.
Trying to make us work? Oh. Hang on, look. There's a lolly. And another lolly. Oh, there's a whole trail of lollies.
So we have to choose? One leads home and the other...
Hey, come. Follow the trail. Otherwise, there's more for me. 1 billion lollies. 10,000
Okay.
lollies. Come on, Gretala. Hey, this one's the color of the head. It's so good. I think there's more lollies inside the tin.
Isn't that a bit suspicious?
I think it's a bit delicious. More for me. Where did they go? Where did the lollies go? Man, this tin is catfish. What's the... Is there... Anyway.
Why are there so many carrots?
Carrot, but no lollies. That's mine.
No, I saw it first!
I wanted
You shouldn't take what's not yours. Now you will serve me.
Who are you?
I am Sir Rias.
Are you serious?
Okay, Mr. Rias, that's mine, so give it back!
Get up, get up, get up, get up! Ow, come on!
Fighting is futile.
You are futile!
You must be the stupid one.
Oh, shame! We're both the stupid one.
I'm not stupid.
A selfish young soul can change the way a seed grows. Finally, I have someone, or
Yes.
some two, to grow me the golden carrot.
A carrot? Just grow it yourself.
This golden carrot can only be grown by a selfish, young, greedy soul.
Well, unlucky us. We don't do work.
Yeah.
We're living.
Okay, off you go.
Going now.
Bye, Mr. Rias, sir.
Oh, what is this?
I think he's cast like a spell.
Oh, I hate spelling.
Let me make you a deal. If you complete this task for me, I'll show you the way home.
Fine. Okay.
Happy to have an understanding. Boy, follow me. Yes, magical forest. Share your gifts with this young, selfish, and greedy soul. You must catch the waterfall of surprise.
What water? Ah! What was that?
Surprise! When the water calls, you must catch it. The golden carrot can grow from one of these seeds. I'm not sure which one, so you'll just have to grow them all. The scroll says, the golden core groweth in earth that is soaked with water of surprise and beaten like the drums of war. Yep.
Come on, water. Where are you? Ah!
Come on, boy. You must catch that water.
Ah! Can you tell me where the water's gonna be?
You must listen.
Where? Ah! You pointed at the door. I got the water.
Quickly!
I need more water than that.
I know. I'm listening.
Hurry up, go get some more.
Ah, I'll get you water. Hey, look.
Pull it out!
Is this it?
That's not golden. Keep planting!
Ah, I can hear you. Oh,
Is this it?
No. Keep planting.
is this the golden carrot, Mr. Rias? You ate all the carrots, eh?
Is this it?
No. We've been doing this for weeks.
Do you think Dad misses us?
Wish I wasn't lazy.
Gretala, where are you?
I'm missing him too. Give away all my lollies to hear you.
Tell us what to do, be more thankful to.
Say the quiet things loud. Do things to make you proud.
I hope you don't hate me.
Just want to show you we are more than lazy. More than lazy.
Hanseli, give me a hand.
Finally! Give it to me.
Yes! We're free!
Rafi! Well done. Well done.
That means you can let us go now.
I did say that, didn't I? A selfish young soul can change how a seed grows.
No, you read the scroll wrong. It says, a selfish young soul who can change their ways can change how a seed grows.
Interesting. Time to set you free.
We had a deal.
You've grown one golden carrot. Maybe you should grow me a few more.
You can't make us.
Let me remind you who has all the power.
I want to see my dad and tell him that I'm sorry.
Me too. Here, break it.
Be careful. He knows karate.
My hair!
Oh, snap!
We're free.
Too bad I have another one. I forgot to charge it.
We're free. Let's go.
Wait! That carrot is mine!
Then come and get it.
home.
Yeah,
I need to go gym, eh?
after you. Dad.
Wake up.
Dad.
Oh, wait. Oh, I thought I lost you. Oh, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have left you out there. I was wrong.
It's okay, Dad.
And we're really sorry for not helping you and for being really, really lazy.
It's okay, my children.
From now on, we're gonna do all the chores.
And this is for you.
Oh, it's heavy. Is this gold?
Yeah. It's as heavy as 24 carats.
24 karat gold. Wow. Thank you so much, my children.
There's more where that came from.
Woohoo! Let's grow!
Once upon a time, we share the stories of old. Bring the book to life in a way never told.